Hi everyone, I'm Delina Amsters and I'm very excited to be giving the first presentation at today's workshop about making research understandable. My task in this first presentation is to talk about why we should make research writing, or more generally what I'll call academic writing, why we should make it easy to understand. For me, this cartoon sums up perfectly why we should make academic writing easy to understand. Goat asks Pig, "What's with all the books?" Pig says, "I bought them because knowledge is power." Goat politely points out, "But first you have to read them." And poor Pig says, "There's always a catch." There we go, presentation done. Knowledge is power, but knowledge has to be consumed for it to be power. Well, maybe I'm not quite finished my presentation yet, but there is a lot to unpack from that cartoon. Where do we usually see academic writing? It's the writing we see in peer-reviewed journal articles, oral research presentation slides, research posters, research reports, and research dissertations. And what's the typical style? Well, it's characterised by a formal, impersonal tone, mostly in the passive voice. It's mostly written in the third person, and it uses complex words and sentence structures. It's dominated by discipline-based vocabularies, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that today. It presents content in an objective way using facts and references. What we don't see in academic writing are contractions. We don't see doesn't, we see do not. We don't see slang words and colloquialisms. We would never see heaps of data. We don't see vague expressions, emotional language, generalizations and stereotyping. I think it's helpful for me to present you with an example of academic writing. Now, I promise you, all I did was put in some search terms into a database about academic writing and learning, and this is what came up. It was the first example. I haven't cherry-picked this example. Bear with me while I read it to you. It's a summary of a peer-reviewed paper titled "Dialogue and Language as Factors Contributing to Transformative Learning in Academic Tutoring." Here we go. The summary. Among a number of teaching practices, personalised education is gaining in popularity owing to its enticing appeal of a novel humanistic attitude with unparalleled pedagogical results unlike those observed in traditional standardised mass education models. As part of the fourth movement in the history of education, personalised education under the guise of tutoring or educational coaching is boldly re-entering schools and the academic world. Observing the daily practices of tutors and educational coaches on various levels of schooling, we can note a number of features which contribute to the emergence of a model where learning becomes an autonomous lived experience. And I continue. In this model, communication is understood as a collaborative dialogical practice, which leads us to see learning as a result of interactivity in the learner-tutor dyad afforded by geospatial conditions, physiopsychological elements, and language. All these contribute to the occurrence of transformative results as evidenced in student post-tutoring narratives. In this paper, we present learning in the dialogical tutor-tutee paradigm as a distributed, embodied and enacted meaning-making process, rather than mere sending and receiving of substantive information. Described as such, the method fits in the paradigm of self-regulated learning. We therefore postulate the claim that personalised education, as exemplified by tutoring, is co-agential and prompts learning on multiple timescales. Consequently, cognition and learning in tutoring is enactment of knowledge while coordinating speech rather than knowledge transmission. And I have in fact practiced that a few times, but still I stumble. Whew. Now, I didn't read that to you to critique the writing per se. I just want you to think about the summary I just read and think about it in conjunction with my opening statements about how knowledge is power, but knowledge needs to be understandable for it to actually bring power to people. Okay, let's move on. How did we get academic writing in the first place? It arises from discourse communities, and a discourse community is a community of people who share basic goals or interests and ways of communicating about them. Probably the most common that we think of are academic discourse communities, so academics within particular disciplines. But there's many other types of discourse communities, including those that centre around industries, professions, types of business, and even hobbies and sports have their own discourse communities. The concept behind a functioning discourse community is that it has a shared language that allows a minimum of information to be transferred with the fewest words. So if everyone in the community is fluent in the language, then everyone should get the same message. What could possibly go wrong? I think this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon explains perfectly what's gone wrong. Calvin, the little boy, says, "I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. I realised that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog." He says, "Want to see my book report?" And his mate Hobbes, the tiger, reads his book report title, which is "The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes." And Calvin says, "Academia, here I come. Oh dear." What does academic writing look like when it goes wrong? It's probably evident from the cartoon what academic writing looks like when it goes wrong. But if we're going to put a few key words down to describe it, I think it could be these. It's pedantic. It's caught up in minutiae. It's convoluted, and it requires deciphering. Actually, the cartoon's also suggesting there's a pretentiousness, and this also links up with gatekeeping around a particular discourse community and their body of knowledge. The problem is that the information or the knowledge that's trying to be transferred is then not even clear to within the discourse community, let alone outside the discourse community. And I think the example I read shows you how laborious academic writing can be, and how much of pedantic, convoluted, deciphering requirements that can be involved. To go a bit more specifically into the problems, I want to pull from the work of Steven Pinker, who is a psycholinguistics scholar, I'm just going to pull out a few of the things that he highlights as being key to why academic writing has become, in some instances, very impenetrable. So, it's upfront, I'd like to say I probably am guilty of all of these things on a daily basis. I think the key here is being aware of them as a starting point. The first is the excessive use of abstractions. Abstractions are ideas or words like issues, strategies, contexts, and oh my goodness, the word models. I exclaim about the word models because I think the word is being misused a great deal in writing that's related to health service delivery. Next is thoughtless abbreviation. How often do we create abbreviations as part of an exercise in reducing words? As someone who does a lot of peer reviewing, excess abbreviation drives me crazy. I find it really hard to keep unfamiliar abbreviations in my head. And in order to understand a sentence, you have to put something into that space of the abbreviation. So you go back and remind yourself what the abbreviation was inserted for. Next, compulsive hedging through overuse of expressions like somewhat, comparatively, and to a certain degree. As researchers, we're taught to do this. Rarely would we say that our findings prove something or that something absolutely causes something else. Of course, there's times a writer must hedge or the accuracy of their statement will rightly be called into question. The problem with hedging is that it's just being overdone, somewhat, comparatively, and to a certain extent, in part, fairly, almost, apparently, nearly, predominantly, presumably, relatively, seemingly. You see what I mean? And finally, the big one, jargon. And Steven Penker has looked at this and he believes a surprising amount of discourse community jargon is really unnecessary. And his favourite example, I think, is the murine model, which in fact means using rats. A bit more about why it goes wrong. The internet abounds with theories about why it has gone wrong. And these are just a few. It's thought that maybe it's about the imitation phenomenon. So a group of writers write in a certain way. Junior researchers will imitate the writing styles of those who've gone before, and the problem is just self-perpetuating. It seems like a theory that holds water. Another theory, and I think from my perspective there is something in this, that we've had an absolute explosion of scientific publication, and if one of the points of peer review was to make sure that writing was understandable, simply there is no hope that we can be dying in a ditch over everything in a paper that is not clear. It's just coming at us so thick and fast. I really, though, appreciate as a peer reviewer when articles are written well and I don't have to do all the deciphering. The next things sound a bit harsh, but there's certainly a lot of people in the internet sphere who are commenting on academic writing who say that it's bad because of scientific backside covering and that academics have a defensive position, which is one of the reasons why they use so much hedging, and probably even more unkindly. But we do know that academia is a jungle and it's publish or perish, and there's a need to impress with publication, and one way of baffling and people think impressing is with what turns out to be waffle. Sounds a bit unkind, but there we have it. still more about why academic writing goes wrong. And I think that there certainly is evidence to back up these claims, which you will see a lot in the internet communities that talk about this. Mostly it's thought to be due to cognitive biases. The first thing to think about in cognitive biases is chunking, which is not a cognitive bias per se, but it's a cognitive strategy that we all use that introduce problems with clarity. So chunking is when we bind information together to create a whole. Chunking is a memory strategy, we all use it, but it's also how people compartmentalize information as they become more expert in their fields. If we think about those abstractions that I mentioned earlier, the use of the word issues could be seen as an example of chunking. If I write in my research area that people with spinal cord injury experience issues managing bowel continence, which impacts on their ability to participate in life, in my discourse community, we probably think we all know what we're talking about when it refers to issues, but maybe we can't be certain that we're all chunking it in the same way. So you see the problem. The next cognitive bias is around functional fixedness. To use a cliche, functional fixedness is when someone can't see outside the box. As experts develop their expertise, they'll use terms to mean something, and they might completely lose sight of how that term may be obscured to others, or the way that it might mean something else. And finally, if you put these together, you get what is frequently referred to as the curse of expertise. If you know something, it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of someone who doesn't know. And I think what all this points to is that to write better, to write more clearly, and to write for understanding is going to require critical self-reflection. Finally, I promise you, this is my last slide about why has academic writing gone wrong. This one possibly matters more than all the others, and it's probably the elephant in the room. Here's the poor elephant on the psych's couch. I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. This elephant in the room is there are few incentives to write differently or to write better or to write to be understood. I know it's all a bit disheartening, but I firmly believe that acknowledging some of the reasons why academic writing can be so impenetrable is really important if we're going to turn it around. Now, I said there's few incentives. It may be more accurate to say there are few concrete or tangible incentives. So I'm rewinding now, right back to the beginning, to what my presentation is meant to be about. Why should we make academic writing easy to understand? Now, I feel I had to tell you all that other stuff first, so I'm sorry, but here it is. I admit I've gone on a bit of a journey. As I just told you, the elephant in the room is that there's no incentive to make academic writing more accessible. And I've said, and I clarified that, I said that there's not a concrete incentive, but there really are incentives, and they are the why. They are why we should do it. Let's take a look at the why. Respect. My first why deals with respect. Making research writing accessible to research participants and end users of the research is simply the right thing to do, out of respect for all those stakeholders. Similarly, those who funded the research deserve to be afforded the ability to understand the implications of what the funding has achieved. And when I speak about funders, I'm referring to organisations, of course, that decide about how they dispense the funding, but also the tax-paying public who ultimately is behind a lot of the funding. Next, understanding results of research is likely to be vital for translating research into practice. And when I say understanding, I mean all those stakeholders. It's not a guarantee that results will be translated. It's a component of translation. However, I think it's a fundamental component of translation. On a broader level, there are societal tensions about how science in general needs to be communicated. People won't engage with something they can't understand. This is very much tied to the topic of health literacy and digital literacy, and so many people are accessing their health information from digital sources. And unfortunately, some of the shortcomings of academic writing, like too much hedging, can leave the door open to those who communicate pseudoscience in a very emphatic language and in appealing mediums, I might say. Finally, I like to talk about the democratisation of research knowledge, and this is a great quote from the late political sociologist Charles Tilly, who said in 2005, "Knowledge-based inequality prevails in the contemporary world." This lack of being able to distribute, but then understand the knowledge, that it can hold certain parts of society back from reaching their full potential. And surely this is a powerful reason to make research knowledge more accessible. So, what principles should we follow? I just want to leave you with this one thought that comes from Steven Pinker. Write as though you have a conversation with the reader. Write as though you're having a conversation with the reader, trying to explain to them this thing, whatever it may be, that you're both interested in. I think if you can bear that in mind, I think it's a great start. Thank you for listening.